Hello and welcome to Queer Conversation, the podcast where we delve into the vibrant and diverse world of LGBTQI+ culture, history and life. This is a space where we celebrate all identities and expressions and explore the personal and political aspects of being queer. Each episode we bring you thought-provoking discussions, personal stories and insights from leading figures and unsung heroes from the LGBTQI+ community. From activism to art, personal struggles to collective victories, Queer Conversation is here to amplify the voices that need to be heard. Whether you identify as LGBTQI+ or you're an ally wanting to learn more, or if you're just curious about the myriad experiences that make up the queer community, this podcast is for you. So sit back, relax, and let's start a conversation. Today we have a very special guest with us, Barbara Baird. Barbara is a renowned scholar and influential figure in the field of gender studies and LGBTQI+ activism in Australia. She has made significant contributions to our understanding of sexuality, gender and citizenship through her insightful research and writings. Barbara is one of the authors of the book Personal Politics, Sexuality, Gender and the Remaking of Citizenship in Australia, a comprehensive study that covers 50 years of activism in Australia, from marriage reform and women's refuge to AIDS and HIV funding and even the Manchettes movement. This book critically examines the wins and losses of these new ways of imagining citizenship. Barbara's work has been instrumental in shedding light on the personal stories that have been made political and the issues and identities that now dominate our public life. Her insights have helped shape discussions and understandings around these topics, making her a respected voice in the field. We are thrilled to have Barbara Baird with us today to delve deeper in these topics to discuss her book, Personal Politics. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Baird to our podcast. Welcome to Queer Conversation, Barbara. You have just co-authored a book that is called Personal Politics, Sexuality, Gender and the Remaking of Citizenship in Australia. Why this book now?
There's no simple answer because the now actually has a 10-year history. With Lee Boucher, Michelle Arrow and Robert Reynolds, I started thinking about this project, and there were a few others involved initially actually, but it became the four of us. I started thinking with them about this project about 10 years ago, and we applied for funding from the Australian Research Council, which is what academics do, and it took us 3 goes to get the funding. And so we started working on the project perhaps around about 2017, but then the project was extended because of the difficulties of working through COVID. So the fact that it's come out now in 2024 is a little bit of an accident of a few things that were beyond our control. Certainly, the marriage equality campaign, which is the last chapter in the book, it was obviously at the forefront of our minds as we started the real work of the project. And that's particularly because it was seen at the time, and I think is still seen, as some kind of final achievement in campaigns for rights for LGBTIQA+ people. So, yes, there is some coincidence, but the project is much broader. It's also about gender and feminist campaigns, and it's also about campaigns that are not feminist or queer, but are very concerned with the issues of gender. So why now? It's been a long process and we're really excited that it's finally come to fruition. Personal Politics, Sexuality, Gender and the Remaking of Citizenship in Australia. It's a history of the last 50 years or so of campaigns about sexuality and gender politics in Australia. So if we think 50 years ago, that is back in the late 60s, early 70s, which, as you've noted, is a significant period of change. And in our case, it's a period of change in relation to gender and sexuality that kind of begins by this move of making what had been personal and private issues public and making them political issues. And this, we argue, but it's not contentious, this is a really significant change in the way that women and also in that early period, gay and lesbian people who hadn't really been public speaking subjects until then. It's a big change in the way that these politics were conducted. Now, 50 years later, it's not, it's kind of not surprising in any context to find people putting personal issues onto the public agenda and making them political issues. So the personal and the political are not so distinct domains, if you like, anymore. But they were in the 1960s, and the amazing kind of transformation that feminism and then gay and lesbian politics brought about was to put personal issues, for example, about violence in domestic relationships, about birth control and abortion, about sexual identity, about sexual practices, to put all those kind of things on the political agenda. And this was done by the revolutionary means in the 1970s of encouraging people to speak out. So there were in Australia speak outs about abortion, about domestic violence. People who were gay and lesbian were encouraged to come out and not hide identities or not hide personal experiences, but to put them out there in the public and say these are political matters. So that's the history to personal politics. Personal politics has come a long way. I think where we start in the book is to acknowledge that these days it's no surprise, for example, to find that 3 of the last half dozen or so Australians of the Year have been people who've been centrally involved with campaigning around issues that previously would have been seen as personal. Rosie Batty, who was Australian of the Year in 2015, I think, who comes to that position as a domestic violence campaigner, particularly because her son had been murdered by her previous partner. Grace Tame, more recently, a Tasmanian woman who'd been sexually abused as a young person, and she comes to prominence because she campaigns to have the Tasmanian law changed so that she, as a survivor of sexual abuse, can speak out. And then she's Australian of the Year. And most recently, Taryn Brumfitt, who's a South Australian, and her issue is body image. And she became Australian of the Year, which gave her a platform to campaign on those issues. So being Australian of the Year says something about how we imagine our national champions, and personal politics are now front and centre, just using that as a kind of way to think about the public sphere in Australia. And of course, there's so many issues at the moment that regularly get prominence that are issues of personal and private life, but we understand them as political issues. So that's what the personal politics in the title of the book refers to. And I guess our claim and our observations through looking at a variety of case studies are that the personal is political, established by feminism and gay and lesbian movements in the late 60s and 70s, has remade how we think about citizenship in Australia. So in our reflection on 50 years of history, we are observing and arguing that citizenship is experienced differently now because of these campaigns of the last 50 years. So literally there's been law reforms and government policies and funding allocations that have changed the way citizenship is experienced. Women are not necessarily second-class citizens in the way that they might have been 50 or 60 years ago. And the same is true for queer people, that there's been law reforms, there's been recognition by government policy, by, Australian of the Year arrangements. Sometime, maybe in the last 10 years, Rodney Croome, who's a very significant activist from Tasmania, he was a contender for Australian of the Year. He wasn't chosen. So this notion of literal legal reform and political allocation of resources, but also a sense of belonging, has changed.
The book covers 50 years of movement, and from a variety of like marriage equality to women's refugees, including even manshed. How did you decide what to include in the book?
Well, that was a process of discussion over probably a year or so, because there's lots of other research that we've done as part of our project that's not included in the book. So, for example, I did some research and I've published a paper looking at submissions written by lesbian mothers to government inquiries in Australia. That research didn't get into the book, and there were other things that other people did. So I don't know, it was just a kind of a process of feeling our way, thinking, okay, we've done a lot of research, how can we pull this together in a book? And that process probably took a year or so. We wanted to include a fair range of both feminist campaigns and LGBTIQA plus campaigns, and also we wanted to include campaigns or social movements that were what you might describe as from the conservative side of women's politics or men's politics. So you mentioned, I think, the men's sheds movement, and that's been a movement of men, I think, since the early 90s. And two of my colleagues did the research on that and really, to be honest, had a lot of fun with it. But also acknowledging that this movement has been very significant as a kind of movement. It's a fairly conservative movement that makes fairly conservative representations of who men are and what men need. And it's been extraordinarily successful. And men's sheds have been given funding over the years, often as part of men's health funding. So we were really interested in comparing how that fairly conservative group of white men have been successful in making their claims about what their needs are, and how men's sheds might help them deal with their issues of isolation and health and poor mental health and suicidality and so on. We were looking to compare that fairly conservative movement of white men to some other campaigns that have made similar claims but haven't been so successful. And in the early period, we look at the response from fathers to the Whitlam-era divorce law reforms, and also the response of conservative women's groups. You might even say anti-feminist women's groups of the 70s and how they responded to divorce law reforms. So the book is not just tracking feminist and queer campaigns and their success, and they haven't always been successful. It's looking or creating a history that's much more a mix of progressive and conservative social movements or organisations, and how they combine and work up against each other to deliver social change in certain ways for certain groups of people, and often also to the exclusion of others.
What stood out for each group when you compare them, conservative group versus our community? Did you have any key findings there?
Well, to go back to the men's shed, and this was a chapter that we talked about a lot because we wanted to be sensitive. The chapter on men's sheds is also a chapter about the campaigns around the Defence of the Safe Schools campaign. So we bring these two case studies together. So, and we focus particularly on the emergence of trans kids as people with a political voice, as they emerged in the Defence of the Safe Schools campaign in 2016, 2017. We compare the trans kids with the men's shed movement. Now, that might strike you as a very strange pairing to bring together, but the reason we brought them together was that both of those groups, the predominantly white men who have campaigned successfully for men's sheds, and we're not saying that men's sheds are not a good thing in our community, but they are represented in a particular way that really draws on a white Australian tradition of mateship that's got a lot of problems to it. One of the reasons we wanted to put together men's sheds with the trans kids who were campaigning to defend safe schools, which, as I'm sure your listeners would know, was a set of programs that began in Victoria and then became national, that set out to offer schools resources so that they could become safer places for gender diverse, trans and queer kids. So in the beginning of 2016, safe schools came under attack, and there was a lot of efforts from the young people who'd experienced safe schools to defend it. The reason we brought trans kids defending safe schools together in a chapter with men's sheds was because both groups used claims about needing safe space. Both groups used claims about the effects on their mental health and in particular on their suicide rates, of the fact that they were often in unsafe spaces, or their needs were unmet, or their identities were not recognised. And to cut a long story short, the claims made by the white men, who are the predominant group in the men's shed movement, and these are like community sheds where men can go, work shoulder to shoulder with each other, share their problems, get away from their wives, and just feel better about themselves and have some meaning and support. What we found was that the men's sheds have been much more successful in getting government funding to support their needs to find safe spaces because of all their issues than the trans kids were in their defence of safe schools. And so we kind of, from there, raised some critical questions about the effects of basing your activism in claims of suffering, and in particular of claims about your mental health and your rates of suicide. Because here we have a kind of emerging and we might say progressive group of people, young trans people, compared with a much older and longer standing white male tradition. And it's the white men who've been more successful in claiming they need safe spaces than the trans kids were. So, yeah, what happens when you compare suffering? Is my suffering more worthy of government amelioration than yours? Are the white men who need men's sheds, are their needs more valid because they too are suffering, because they've lost privilege in some respect? Are their needs more, or is their suffering more valid than the suffering of young trans people? We ask critical questions about that, because sometimes when suffering, mental health and well-being and even suicide rates are at the forefront of a campaign, bigger campaigns about structural oppression and injustice and marginalisation get lost. So I hope I've done justice to that chapter and that rather odd pairing, but comparing two different movements that use similar rhetoric and finding one group of people are much more successful. And men's sheds continue with quite significant funding in Australia. Comparing those two, I think, gives us some insight into how social change happens, or how certain kinds of change is stopped or blocked, because the Safe Schools movement did not win out in the end after it was attacked so significantly.
A lot of really interesting topics in there that is covering, and obviously put together by for individuals who are experts in that area. So if anyone is interested in the history of LGBTQIA plus in Australia and activism movement, I think this is an excellent book to get into.
The other example that came to mind, it's a chapter in the middle of the book, and it's about the 1980s and the 1990s. So the book is ordered, chronologically. The earlier chapters deal with the 70s and how the 70s really shifted these debates from the way they had been framed previously. The chapter about the 80s and the 90s, or one of them, looks at the way that women's refuges were being thought about, and the way demands were being made on governments to support and fund women's refuges through the 80s and 90s, particularly in New South Wales. It looks at that alongside the history of Mardi Gras. So these are two kind of New South Wales case studies. And this chapter really focuses on the growing presence of neoliberalism in Australia. And by neoliberalism, we mean particularly government policies that are withdrawing funding from the welfare state. So there's this shift that begins with a Labor government in the 1980s, actually, that starts to not be so amenable to providing resources that will address social inequality. Neoliberalism also is a set of economic policies and the idea that we should look to the market rather than to government to drive society, to drive social change even. And neoliberalism also refers to a set of ideas about the individual and society being made up of individuals rather than collectives, like groups of people like women or gay and lesbian people. So what this chapter looks at is the way that after the initial very exciting period that begins in the 70s. There was this kind of growth of women's refuges all around the country quite quickly. And this was a feminist movement. And the refuges were staffed by feminists who were really committed to a feminist political analysis and to offering women who were fleeing domestic violence refuge. It was a very successful movement in its earliest years. But then as the 1980s kind of starts to unfold and neoliberalism as a way of thinking about society and as a way of government addressing problems starts to become more prominent, women's refuges start to have more and more difficulty in saying, from a feminist point of view, here's the problem. It's a problem of a patriarchal society. One of the ways to deal with the problem of domestic violence is to have feminist-run refuges. That argument starts not to be so successful anymore. Feminist analysis starts not to be so successful anymore in relation to government funding. Now, at the same time, Mardi Gras begins as this big celebration, starts in 1978, and through the 80s starts to grow and face challenges as well as successes. But Mardi Gras through the 80s has a lot more success in appealing to kind of neoliberal framings of why a certain community or a certain event, Mardi Gras, should be supported. And one of the things that Mardi Gras did in 1993, they commissioned and released an economic impact statement that showed to the New South Wales government in particular what great economic benefit Mardi Gras brought to the state and to the economy. Now, women's refuges were never going to be able to show that they delivered economic benefit. In as much as they tried to by saying, domestic violence is a great social and economic cost to our society, they were never as successful as Mardi Gras was in making that argument. And I think since the period in which we focus in that chapter, Mardi Gras has become more and more successful in attracting corporate sponsorship and being able to show that, even in its wildest and most outrageous moments, it is contributing to the economy. So those two case studies, the fate of women's refuges, particularly in New South Wales through the 80s and early 90s, and the fate of Mardi Gras, make a really interesting comparison about how these two different parts of feminism and the queer movement have different success in engaging with this kind of neoliberal way of thinking about the world that becomes much more dominant in Australia in the 80s and 90s. That's not the only chapter where we find that feminist analysis doesn't necessarily do so well as a certain kind of more palatable queer analysis. Although I think there are also cases where feminist campaigns have had more success in particular moments than queer campaigns. So bringing these case studies together enables us to have a bit of a broader vision and a broader view about what kind of campaigns work and who can make successful campaigns and who can't. If we want to address the problem of domestic violence, we really have to address patriarchal relations between men and women, put bluntly. And that's a really hard argument to package into an argument that's all about economics. So that's just a kind of another little taste of the pairing of two different case studies.
What do you try to achieve with the book?
Okay, it is an academic book, and that will probably be where its readership is found most. But I think that it's readable enough and interesting enough to appeal to other people who are not students or academics, who are interested in history and interested in feminist politics and interested in queer politics. So, I think there'll be a lot of people who'll find that this is a book that will be intriguing and that will offer them something. But it is an academic book, and, we're hoping it will be read by history students and gender studies students and sexuality studies students and so on, sociology students as well as researchers. So that's the matter of readership. And in the big picture, I think, because we're all historians, I guess we all have some kind of belief that understanding our history is useful always for understanding where we are now. So that's a kind of a general motive that historians employ. And I guess I would say that's particularly true when it's a recent history. So the last 50 years will be a history that many of us, perhaps of our generation, Silke, will have lived through, as well as younger people who have a sense of the last 50 years, but didn't live through the 70s and 80s and the 90s, perhaps. So I think it's always useful to understand your history, and I think it can be incredibly powerful to understand yourself as part of history, and this book will offer that to many people. I mean, most people who read the book will have lived through the marriage equality campaign, for example. So to give yourself a history, I think, is always really important. I think of the book as answering or trying to answer the question, how much has changed in the last 50 years in relation to gender and sexuality? And this is a question I grapple with in the classroom with my students, particularly young students, who tend to have, can have a very naive view of thinking that things are so much better now than they were 50 years ago. But also some things have gotten worse. And I also think to think about, have things gotten better or worse over a 50-year period isn't always the best way to think about them, because the issues have changed, the environment has changed, and how people think about ourselves has changed. So one of the comments we make is that the queer activists or the gay and lesbian activists of the 1970s would not recognise themselves in the kind of LGBTQIA plus movement of the 2010s and the 2020s. The people who are the activists in these campaigns are quite different people facing different environments, and the way issues come together is quite different now from the way they came together 50 years ago. So I think the book answers this question, what's changed? And how can we think about that change? Remembering the energy of activism. And our book is a tribute to the activists working in relation to gender and sexuality of the last 50 years, as much as it is also an analysis and a critical analysis. I think the energy of activism is the way forward. That's what I tell my students. To survive the 21st century, you have to be an activist on whatever the issue is that is your passion. And I think remembering that the capacity that we have to change society around us and to change our relationships and so on, that's really important to hang on to.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and your co-authors for putting this book together. And I'm really looking forward to reading it.
Thanks, Silke.
Thank you for joining us today on Queer Conversation. We hope that our discussions have enlightened you, challenged you, and perhaps even inspired you. Remember, every voice matters and every story is important. We are grateful to have you as part of our community, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful conversations in our next episode. Until then, stay safe, stay proud, and keep the conversation going. This is Queer Conversation. Signing off, goodbye and take care.